Christmas Eve in Barbados, a night that should have been filled with music, candlelight, and prayer, instead carried within it a silence heavy enough to suffocate. On the surface, the island glimmered like a jewel in the Caribbean crown of the British Empire. Sugar wealth had made Barbados rich beyond imagination. The plantation owners lived in mansions that could rival anything in London, while their tables overflowed with roasted meats, imported wines, candied fruits, and delicacies sent across the Atlantic. Tonight, they celebrated with laughter and song, their feasts glowing with candles and silverware polished to perfection. The churches rang their bells, reminding the faithful of the joy of Christ's birth, and to the world beyond the island, Barbados seemed the very picture of festive abundance. But just beyond the grand plantation houses, in the shadows of cane fields and boiling houses, the story was very different. For the enslaved men and women who toiled endlessly to make this glittering world possible, Christmas brought no joy, no respite, no comfort. If anything, it sharpened the sting of their bondage. As the planters' children unwrapped gifts of books, ribbons, and sugar toys, the enslaved children watched with empty hands, their stomachs hollow, their feet scarred from endless work in the fields. They knew the scent of roasted pork and baked breads, but only from afar, as scraps might be tossed their way if their masters felt generous. And in the boiling houses, the heart of the sugar empire, the great iron vats hissed and steamed through the night, vats that did not rest, even on holy days. The work continued without mercy, because sugar could not wait. It was in this landscape of contrast, abundance and deprivation, light and suffocating darkness, that one woman's story was written in fire, steam, and blood. Enslaved, nameless in the records that survive, she had lived every day in chains both physical and psychological. She had felt the whip split her back, had watched fellow slaves collapse from exhaustion under the Caribbean sun, and had seen cruelty dealt out casually by men who believed themselves divinely entitled to rule over others. Yet on this night of supposed goodwill, she decided that her suffering would no longer be silent. As her master reveled in his comfort, perhaps drunk on wine, perhaps smug in the security of his wealth and position, she prepared to shatter the illusion of order that held the island together. The act she chose was not random. It was not a fit of madness or a simple outburst of violence. It was symbolic, deliberate, and horrific in a way that forced her master, and every planter who heard of it, to face the truth they feared most, that the very tools of their wealth, the very machinery that made them kings, could be turned against them. When she pushed him into the vat, when his screams cut through the still Caribbean night, it was not only a man who boiled in sugar, but the illusion of absolute control. His body melted into the very substance he had profited from. The sweet crystals that were shipped to Europe now mixed with the memory of his agony. For the masters who heard of it, the horror was beyond comprehension. This was not a theft, not a runaway attempt, not the small acts of rebellion they expected and punished daily. This was a direct assault on the foundation of their world, a grotesque reminder that beneath the silence of the enslaved lay rage waiting to explode. For the enslaved, word of such acts spread in whispers, carried from plantation to plantation like embers in the wind. It was terrifying, yes, but also a spark of hope, that even one among them could strike back in a way so unforgettable. This story is not a tale of comfort. It is a story meant to unsettle, to draw you into the contradictions of an island where Christmas carols mingled with screams, where sugar sparkled on European tables while blood steamed in the boiling houses. Tonight, you will journey into the world of Barbados at the height of its sugar empire, a world built on unimaginable suffering, a world that tried to erase the humanity of its enslaved but could not erase their will to resist. At the heart of it is a single act of rebellion, one that forces us to ask, what drives a human being to commit an act so brutal, so symbolic, so unforgettable? And what does it tell us about the world in which she lived? This is the story of the slave who boiled her master alive in the sugar vat on Christmas Eve, and through it, the story of the empire built on sweetness and cruelty, celebration and terror. It begins in silence, in darkness, in the heat of the Caribbean night, but it will end in fire and steam that the planters of Barbados could never forget. Barbados in the 17th and 18th centuries was no paradise for those who worked its soil, though the island was often described by European travelers as a glittering jewel. It was called Little England, a place where the British Crown's wealth seemed limitless, a colony that became the richest possession of the empire because of one thing: sugar. Sweet crystals harvested from the cane fields filled the ships that crossed the Atlantic, lining the tables of aristocrats in London, Paris, and Amsterdam. To the European elite, Barbados was a marvel, the kind of place where money seemed to flow endlessly. But that endless river of wealth was not built on industry and innovation alone. It was built on bodies. The island was a vast machine of human suffering, one of the harshest plantation societies the world had ever seen. The sugar plantation system devoured labor in staggering amounts. To produce a single ton of sugar, countless hours of grueling work were required. Planting, tending, cutting cane so sharp it sliced skin like knives, hauling heavy stalks, and then feeding them into the great rollers that crushed the juice. Once extracted, the juice went into boiling houses, dark, suffocating spaces where enormous vats simmered with heat so intense that men fainted, collapsed, and often died at their posts. In those vats, the raw juice became molasses and crystals, destined to sweeten the cups of tea and pastries of Europe. For every spoonful of sugar, there was a human cost measured in blood, burns, broken bodies, and lives cut short. The enslaved population of Barbados was not small, it was overwhelming. By the 18th century, enslaved Africans outnumbered whites nearly 10-1, their presence a constant reminder that the society rested on terror rather than consent. The planters understood this imbalance and ruled with iron fists. Punishments were severe and public. Whippings that left flesh shredded, iron collars with spikes to prevent lying down, mutilations meant to break both body and spirit. The enslaved were treated as tools, disposable when worn out, replaced by new shipments of human cargo brought across the Atlantic in the crowded, disease-ridden hulls of slave ships. Life expectancy on a Barbadian plantation was appallingly low. Many enslaved workers survived only a few years before succumbing to exhaustion, disease, or violence. Yet to the masters, the system was natural, even divinely sanctioned. They fashioned themselves as gentlemen, rulers of estates that mimicked the English countryside, complete with gardens, drawing rooms, and imported luxuries. But these manicured estates were surrounded by fields where enslaved men, women, and children toiled from dawn to dusk. Even Christmas, a season of supposed charity and goodwill, was no reprieve. Some planters might have allowed small gatherings, dances, or the sharing of meager rations, but the work continued regardless. Sugar was a crop that did not wait. Boiling houses could not fall silent, and the prophets could not pause for sentiment. The social order of Barbados was rigid, designed to enforce separation at every level. At the top were the white planters, men who grew unimaginably rich from sugar exports. Beneath them were overseers and managers, often brutal men charged with extracting every ounce of labor from the enslaved. Then there were the house slaves, who worked within the master's home and endured their own humiliations, from servitude to sexual exploitation. And at the bottom stood the majority, the field hands who bore the brunt of back-breaking labor under a scorching sun. Within this structure, humanity was stripped away. Enslaved people were defined in law as property, their worth calculated not by their dreams or dignity, but by their productivity and market value. The psychological toll of such a world was profound. For the enslaved, every day was a negotiation between survival and despair, resistance and submission. For the masters, every day was shadowed by fear. They knew that their wealth rested on the suffering of thousands who outnumbered them, and so they cultivated an atmosphere of paranoia. Laws were written to prevent gatherings, to restrict movement, to punish even the smallest signs of defiance. The lash was not just a tool of punishment, but of control, designed to remind every enslaved worker of their powerlessness. But beneath that surface, anger smoldered. The enslaved carried memories of freedom, of homelands left behind, of ancestors who had lived without chains. That memory could not be erased, and it fed the quiet, persistent dream of resistance. This was the world in which our unnamed woman lived, a world that seemed unshakable, where sugar was king and suffering was currency. Every brick of a planter's mansion, every jewel clasped around the neck of a wealthy lady in Europe, was purchased with the sweat and blood of people who had been stripped of their names, their families, and their futures. And yet, even in such a system designed to break spirits, rebellion could not be extinguished. In whispers, in stolen moments, in secret rituals carried from Africa, the enslaved remembered who they were. And on one Christmas Eve, in the heat of a boiling house, one woman transformed that smoldering anger into fire, using the very heart of the sugar empire to deliver her vengeance. She emerges from the shadows of history without a name, an enslaved woman remembered only because of the horror of her act. The records that survive do not preserve her identity, her family ties, or even her age. To the colonial authorities, she was simply another piece of property, another body in the endless tide of laborers that kept the sugar flowing. Yet in that anonymity lies a haunting truth. Her life was typical of the countless enslaved women who lived and died unseen, their humanity stripped away by a system that sought to reduce them to nothing more than tools. And yet, for a single night, she shattered that invisibility. Her act was so unforgettable, so horrifying, that her master's name survived only because of the way she ended his life. To imagine her story, we must piece it together from what is known about the lives of enslaved women on the plantations of Barbados. From the moment of capture in Africa or birth into bondage, her existence was shaped by violence. If she was brought across the Atlantic, she endured the Middle Passage, crammed into the hold of a ship where disease, starvation, and suffocation claimed countless lives. If she was born on the island, she would have grown up in the shadow of sugar, watching her parents toil, perhaps watching them whipped, punished, or sold away. Childhood ended quickly in this world. By the age of 10 or 12, enslaved girls were often forced into field work, cutting cane under a blazing sun, carrying bundles heavier than their own bodies, or working in the boiling houses where heat and steam seared their lungs. Her daily life would have been relentless. Before dawn, she would rise, often after only a few hours of sleep, and take her place among the other workers. The overseer's whip cracked in the fields, demanding speed and endurance beyond what the human body was built to sustain. Meals were meager, salted fish, cassava, plantains, and never enough to replenish the energy burned through endless labor. At night, her body must have ached, covered with scars and calluses, but rest was never guaranteed. The enslaved were often summoned at night for additional work, for punishments, or for the whims of their masters. For enslaved women, the burden was heavier still. Beyond the physical torment of plantation work, they endured the constant threat of sexual violence. Masters and overseers saw them as property not only for labor, but for pleasure. A woman like her might have been forced into the master's house, made to serve at his table, clean his clothes, and perhaps endure his assaults. She might have borne children who, by the cruel laws of the island, were born into slavery from the moment they drew breath. A mother's love in such a world was shadowed by terror. At any moment, her children could be sold, taken to another plantation, or simply worked to death before reaching adulthood. To be an enslaved woman was to live with pain that was both physical and deeply personal, a daily stripping away of dignity. And yet, within this bleak existence, she carried something that slavery could not destroy: memory, rage, and the spark of defiance. She must have watched the masters and overseers carefully, learned their patterns, their weaknesses. She must have spoken in whispers with others, sharing stories of rebellion, of poisonings, of escapes, of uprisings that flickered like flames across the Caribbean. Perhaps she remembered songs or prayers from her ancestors, fragments of a culture that the plantation system tried to erase. These quiet acts of endurance were seeds of resistance. They allowed her to hold on to the idea that she was more than what her captors claimed she was. The psychological build-up to her act was not sudden. It was forged over years of humiliation and torment. Each insult, each beating, each indignity planted another layer of anger, another reason to strike back. And unlike many others who endured but never acted, she found herself standing on the edge of a moment when opportunity and fury aligned. To kill a master was not just a crime. It was a declaration of humanity, a refusal to remain silent in the face of absolute domination. By choosing the boiling vat, she chose a method that symbolized everything she had suffered. The sugar, the boiling heat, the endless labor, all the instruments of her torment, became the weapon through which she would make herself remembered. Yet her story also reveals the cruel paradox of resistance. We remember her because of her violence, not because of her life. The colonial record books do not preserve her laughter, her voice, her hopes, or even her name. They tell us of her crime and her punishment, but not of her dreams or the small moments of tenderness she might have shared with others in the slave quarters. She was erased as a human being and immortalized only as a figure of terror. For her master and his peers, she became a warning. For the enslaved, she became a whisper of defiance, proof that even the weakest in the eyes of society could strike at the heart of power. In reconstructing her story, we must balance between silence and imagination, between what is recorded and what is lost. She was not a symbol, not only a rebel. She was a woman who had lived in chains and who chose, on a night filled with carols and feasts, to break those chains in the most shocking way possible. Her life, though buried beneath centuries of silence, still speaks, because in her act she demanded that the world see her not as property, but as a force capable of changing the narrative. And though her name has been lost, her defiance remains etched in history as vividly as the screams that once echoed through that boiling house. The air in the boiling house was always thick, heavy with the sour-sweet stench of sugar juice and smoke. But on Christmas Eve the atmosphere carried a strange quiet, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The planters and their families were gathered in their mansions, their tables glittering with feasts and imported wines, their laughter rising into the night. But in the shadows of the plantation, in the furnace-lit heart of the boiling house, a different story was unfolding, one that would leave an indelible scar on the history of Barbados. The enslaved woman, nameless in the records, had worked long enough in the sugar works to know the rhythms of the place. She knew how the cane juice hissed when it hit the vats, how the air shimmered above the seething liquid, how one misstep could mean burns that scarred for life, or death itself. To the masters, the boiling house was a place of profit, the engine of empire. To the enslaved, it was a place of torment, a chamber where flesh burned and lungs collapsed under the heat. And yet, on this night, she turned the boiling house into something else entirely, a stage of retribution. We cannot know the exact sequence of moments, but we can piece them together from fragments and imagination rooted in the brutal reality of plantation life. Perhaps her master had come to the boiling house that night, drunk from festivities, curious to oversee his wealth being transformed into golden crystals. Perhaps he had followed her, as he had done before, with the arrogance of a man who believed his authority was absolute. Or perhaps he stumbled upon her while she worked, his presence an intrusion she had long endured in silence. Whatever brought him there, it was in that place, under the glow of fire and steam, that she acted. The vat loomed before them, a cauldron of bubbling liquid, its surface churning like molten glass. The air around it was suffocating, the heat so intense it seemed to melt the skin even from a distance. To imagine what happened next is to feel the raw collision of fury and opportunity. With strength born of desperation and rage, she forced him toward the vat. At first, perhaps he thought it a jest, perhaps he laughed in disbelief. But when the realization struck, when his body teetered on the edge and then fell, his laughter turned into something else entirely. The scream that tore from his throat must have cut through the silence of the plantation. It was not the cry of a man whipped or wounded. It was the howl of someone being consumed alive. Sugar juice at boiling point was hotter than water, clinging to flesh, burning deep into muscle. There was no escape, no reprieve, no quick death. His body writhed, the heat peeling away skin, his agony echoing against the wooden walls of the boiling house. For once, the tools of his wealth, the very source of his power, had turned against him. The same vat that had chewed up the lives of countless slaves was now devouring its master. The enslaved workers nearby must have watched in horror, shock, perhaps even secret exhilaration. To see a master brought low in such a way was unthinkable, a reversal of the natural order imposed upon them. But fear must have followed quickly. They knew what this meant, that the response would be swift, merciless, and bloody. Yet in that brief moment, as his body flailed in the bubbling vat, something shifted in the air. The plantation was no longer a place where power flowed only one way. For a heartbeat, the enslaved could glimpse another reality, one in which the master's body could be broken, one in which fear belonged not only to the enslaved but to those who claimed to own them. The imagery of the act cannot be overstated. To boil a man alive in sugar was more than murder. It was symbolic vengeance. Sugar had been the weapon of oppression, the substance for which millions had been enslaved, beaten, and killed. It had destroyed families, erased cultures, and fed an empire. By using sugar as the instrument of death, she turned the very heart of the system into a site of reckoning. His body dissolved in the product that had enriched him. The sweetness that masked so much suffering now fused with his own screams. It was a message carved in fire and steam, that wealth built on torment could end in torment. One can imagine the plantation erupting into chaos after the act. Other enslaved workers must have scrambled, some frozen in terror, others rushing to contain the disaster. Overseers would have been summoned, their torches cutting through the night, their faces twisted with disbelief at what they found. The body of their master, blistered and unrecognizable, floating in the vat that should have held only sugar. The enslaved woman, perhaps standing still, her face unreadable, knowing that whatever punishment awaited her was inevitable. She had already crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. This was no quiet poisoning, no subtle sabotage that could be hidden or denied. This was a public execution, staged in the very machinery of empire. The news would spread with the speed of fire. Masters across the island would hear the story and feel a chill in their bones. They had long feared rebellion, long dreaded the day when the enslaved would rise against them. And here was proof, not of a vast uprising, but of a single woman who had struck back with unthinkable brutality. Her act was not meant to be forgotten. Though she could not know how history would record it, she must have known it would leave a mark. In the silence that followed her master's screams, in the terror that gripped the plantation, she had carved her defiance into the memory of Barbados. It was a deed so raw, so unthinkable, that centuries later it still forces us to confront the brutality of slavery not only as a system of domination, but as a breeding ground for rage that could explode in acts of unimaginable violence. On that Christmas Eve, while the bells of the churches rang out and the planters raised their glasses, one enslaved woman claimed the boiling house as her battlefield. When they finally moved, their voices broke into frenzied shouts, torches were lit, and the entire estate erupted into chaos. News spread quickly. Within hours, neighboring planters knew of the horror. Word carried from one estate to another, whispered in terrified tones, exaggerated with every retelling until the story seemed almost apocalyptic. A master boiled alive by his slave. It was not just murder, it was a nightmare made flesh. For men who believed themselves untouchable, who thought their power divine, the act shattered illusions. The horror lay not only in the death itself, but in the message. The enslaved were watching, waiting, and capable of striking back with a vengeance that could not be contained. The response of the planters was swift and merciless. For generations, they had lived with the constant dread of revolt. They knew the demographics. The enslaved outnumbered them by staggering margins, and the only thing holding back rebellion was fear. That fear had to be reforged immediately, made sharper than ever before. The woman was seized, dragged from the boiling house, and brought before the authorities. She likely faced torture before her execution, beaten and questioned in the desperate hope that she might confess to a wider conspiracy. The planters wanted to believe this was not the act of one woman alone, because if it was, then any enslaved worker could be a hidden threat. Punishment in colonial Barbados was not designed to bring justice. It was designed to instill terror. The enslaved woman who committed the act would not have been given the dignity of a quick death. She may have been burned alive, broken on the wheel, or hanged in public, her body left on display for days as a warning. Every lash of the whip, every drop of blood spilled, was intended to send a message. This is what happens when the enslaved forget their place. The execution would have been staged as theater, forcing enslaved men, women, and even children to witness the spectacle, to inhale the smoke, to hear the screams, and to carry that fear back into the fields. But alongside the punishment came paranoia. Planters doubled their patrols, strengthened their militia forces, and wrote new laws that restricted movement, gatherings, and communication among the enslaved. The killing of one master exposed the fragility of their entire society. If one woman could turn the tools of sugar into weapons, what could hundreds do? What could thousands? Suddenly, every whisper in the quarters, every flicker of defiance, seemed like the spark of rebellion. To the masters, the island felt like it was perched on the edge of a volcano. For the enslaved, the aftermath was a storm of fear mixed with a dangerous kind of inspiration. The brutality of the punishment was unforgettable, a reminder of the consequences of resistance. And yet, the story of the woman's act carried in secret conversations, passed in hushed tones when overseers were not listening. The enslaved knew that one of their own had struck back in a way that could never be erased. Even if her body was destroyed, her defiance lived on. She had done what so many dreamed of but dared not attempt. She had forced her master to feel the same torment he had inflicted on others. The planters, for all their attempts to reassert control, could not shake the image of their fellow masters' screams echoing through the night. It was said that plantation owners across the island grew more anxious after the incident, more cruel in their punishments, more determined to crush even the smallest act of resistance. Their fear translated into violence, and that violence deepened the very rage it sought to extinguish. The cycle of cruelty and rebellion spun tighter, the line between order and chaos thinner with every passing year. This moment in history became a fracture line, a crack that revealed the truth the masters never wanted to admit. Their empire was built not on peace, not on loyalty, but on terror balanced precariously against despair. One woman's act had unsettled the balance, and though her punishment sought to erase her from memory, her shadow lingered. For the enslaved, she became a symbol whispered about in secret, proof that even the smallest hand could tip the scales, that even the most powerless could make the powerful bleed. The Christmas Eve killing had been meant, by colonial justice, to end with the reinforcement of control. Yet in reality, it ended with both sides more afraid than before. The enslaved feared the whip, the rope, the fire. The masters feared the possibility that any night, any moment, could bring another eruption of violence from the very people they sought to break. In the silence after her execution, in the creak of cane fields swaying under the wind, there was no peace. There was only the echo of screams, a reminder to all who heard them that the line between master and victim could, under the right conditions, be obliterated in an instant. The killing of one master in a boiling house might seem like an isolated act of fury, a crime born in a single moment of rage. But to understand it only that way is to miss the larger pattern woven through the history of the Caribbean. The enslaved woman's act was part of a long, unbroken chain of resistance that stretched across islands and decades, each spark feeding another, each whisper of defiance building towards something larger. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, some subtle, some spectacular, some remembered, and many lost to silence. The boiling of a master alive on Christmas Eve fit into this tapestry, both shocking in its brutality and yet deeply connected to the broader psychology of rebellion. On the plantations of Barbados, resistance was constant, even if it did not always take the form of open violence. There were small acts, slowing the pace of work in the fields, breaking tools, feigning illness, or sabotaging the cane mills. Women sometimes slipped poison into food or drink, turning the intimacy of household labor into a weapon. Others risked everything to escape, fleeing into the hills or attempting the impossible journey to another island. These acts rarely toppled the system, but they mattered because each one reminded the enslaved that they still had agency, that they were not entirely powerless. The masters called it laziness or disobedience, but beneath those labels was the truth. The enslaved were fighting in the only ways they could. But sometimes, the resistance was not quiet. Sometimes it roared. Across the Caribbean, uprisings broke out with terrifying force, each one sending shockwaves through colonial society. In 1675, Barbados itself had already witnessed conspiracies, enslaved people plotting to burn plantations and strike down their oppressors. In Jamaica, rebellions erupted again and again, as marooned communities of escaped slaves waged guerrilla wars against the British. In 1736, Antigua was rocked by a major revolt, its leaders executed in public squares to strike fear into others. And in 1791, in Saint-Domingue, what would become Haiti, the largest slave revolt in history exploded, igniting a revolution that would overthrow French colonial rule entirely and give birth to the first Black Republic. The masters of Barbados lived in the shadow of these rebellions. Every planter knew the names of places where resistance had burned too hot to contain. They whispered about Jamaica, trembled at the news from Saint-Domingue, and fortified their estates with militia patrols, fearing that one day the cane fields of Barbados would blaze with rebellion too. The woman who boiled her master alive did not need to have read about these uprisings to feel their spirit. Resistance was in the air, in the shared songs, in the prayers whispered in African dialects, in the stolen stories that moved from one island to another on the lips of sailors and slaves alike. Psychologically, the act of rebellion carried weight beyond its immediate violence. For the enslaved, it was justice in a world where no court, no law, no authority would ever protect them. The boiling vat was not only an instrument of labor, but an emblem of oppression. By using it to kill, she inverted its meaning. For once, the suffering it caused was borne not by the enslaved, but by the master himself. In this sense, her act was part of a tradition of symbolic resistance. Enslaved people striking back in ways that mirrored their own torment. Poison was chosen because they had been poisoned with despair. Fire was chosen because their homes had been burned. And boiling sugar was chosen because it had burned their flesh, destroyed their lives, and chained them in perpetual agony. For the colonial elite, every act of resistance, large or small, was magnified into terror. They saw in each rebellion the possibility of another Haiti. To them, the woman's act was not an isolated murder. It was a reminder of what could happen if fear did not hold. They tightened their laws, but in doing so, they revealed their paranoia. They feared Christmas and Easter most, times when enslaved people might gather in larger numbers, when joy and community could mask the plotting of revolt. They feared the drums, the dances, the very culture that reminded the enslaved of who they were. In their fear, they often became more cruel, which only deepened the cycle of resentment and resistance. The boiling house killing thus sits in the broader narrative of rebellion not as an outlier, but as a symbol of what simmered beneath the surface of every plantation. It shows that resistance was not only collective, but also personal. A single enslaved woman, acting alone, could carry within her all the rage of centuries, and in one explosive act, she could force the empire to confront its own vulnerability. Her defiance was not as large as Haiti's revolution, but it was a fragment of the same fire. It was a reminder that no matter how tightly chains were fastened, the human will to resist could never be fully broken. This act also speaks to the psychology of vengeance. For the enslaved, rebellion was not always about liberation in the abstract. Sometimes it was about settling a debt, balancing scales that seemed immovably weighted. To see a master scream as he had made others scream, to hear him beg for mercy as he had denied mercy, that was a form of justice in a world where official justice did not exist. To modern eyes, it is horrifying, but to those who lived under the lash, it was proof that cruelty could be answered, that the whip could be turned around. As we place her story alongside the broader rebellions of the Caribbean, we see that she was not alone in spirit. She was one voice in a chorus of defiance, a single act in a long campaign of survival and resistance. Her story stands out because of its brutality, but beneath it lies the same truth found in every uprising, that slavery created not only victims but rebels, not only despair but defiance. And in that defiance, the enslaved reminded the empire that its power was never absolute, never secure, and never safe from the fire it had itself ignited. The story of the enslaved woman who boiled her master alive does not end with his death, nor with the crack of the whip that likely followed her capture. In truth, her name was nearly erased from history, her act reduced to a grim anecdote buried in colonial records. Yet, even in silence, her defiance lived on, carried through whispers, through fearful recollections of planters, and through the enduring scars of a system that sought to control not only bodies but memory itself. To speak of her today is to breathe life back into a person the empire tried to forget. It is to acknowledge not only the brutality of her act, but also the brutality that birthed it. For the enslaved who heard of it, her defiance may have offered a strange kind of hope. In a world where they were denied dignity, she had seized power, if only for a fleeting moment. Her rebellion was an assertion that even the most silenced and degraded life could erupt in thunderous resistance. The price she paid was almost certainly her own life. Execution, torture, or public burning to deter others. But within that sacrifice was a truth the masters could not erase, that their authority was fragile, always trembling under the weight of fear. For the planters of Barbados, her act became part of the arsenal of nightmares they carried. They dined in luxury, but in the back of their minds they knew that the hands that poured their wine or tended their fires could one day become their executioners. That paranoia shaped laws, customs, and punishments, intensifying the cruelty of slavery, but also revealing its deep insecurities. Looking back today, her story forces us to confront the uncomfortable contradictions of history. The sugar that sweetened Europe's tea, the desserts that graced the tables of the wealthy, the very symbol of refinement and civility in the 18th century. All of it was stained with the blood and suffering of enslaved laborers. Every crystal carried within it the heat of the boiling house, the cries of the whipped, the weight of chains. To imagine her master's body dissolving in the very vat that had consumed so many lives is to see the cruel symmetry of empire laid bare. What was sweet for some was agony for others, and in that vat, sweetness and suffering fused in a way that could not be ignored. Psychologically, her act remains one of the starkest illustrations of what happens when human beings are pushed beyond endurance. Scholars today speak of the violence of the oppressed, a kind of rebellion born not from savagery, but from desperation, from the crushing realization that no lawful path to justice exists. Her decision was horrific, but it was also rational in its context, the logic of vengeance in a world without fairness. It reminds us that violence is never born in a vacuum. It is cultivated by systems of cruelty, watered with injustice, and ripened under the sun of exploitation until it bursts forth in flames. Her story also forces us to question how history is told. For centuries, colonial accounts dismissed enslaved rebels as barbaric, their actions described in sensational horror, stripped of context or humanity. The master's cruelty was often minimized or excused, while the enslaved were demonized for fighting back. To reclaim this woman's story is to flip that narrative, to see her not as a monster, but as a human being who chose defiance over silence. It does not excuse the horror of her act, but it situates it within the even greater horror of slavery itself. In doing so, we restore to her a piece of the dignity that history tried to deny. Her legacy echoes beyond Barbados, resonating with stories of resistance across the Atlantic world. She stands alongside the Maroons of Jamaica, the rebels of Antigua, the warriors of Saint-Domingue, and the countless unnamed who fought, resisted, and died in silence. She is part of the long road that led to abolition, a reminder that slavery did not collapse under the weight of morality alone, but was shaken, cracked, and finally broken by those who refused to accept it. The rebellion in Haiti, the revolts across the Caribbean, and the countless individual acts of defiance. Together, they carved a path toward freedom. Her Boiling House rebellion may not have toppled an empire, but it was one ember in the firestorm that eventually consumed it. And yet, there is another legacy, one that lingers uncomfortably in our own time. Sugar still sits on our tables, sweet and innocent, its violent history largely forgotten. Tourists walk the beaches of Barbados without hearing the echoes of the boiling houses. The plantations are now ruins or tourist attractions, their brutality softened by time. To remember her story is to resist that forgetting, to insist that sweetness has a cost, that comfort is often built on suffering unseen. It is to honor those whose names never made it into the books, those whose pain was consumed like sugar itself, dissolved, invisible, but always present. The woman who boiled her master alive has no monument. She has no marked grave, no statue in a square, no hymn sung in her memory. What remains is her act, terrifying, unforgettable, and deeply human. In telling her story, we confront not only the darkness of the past, but the fragility of the present, where systems of oppression still thrive in new forms, and where silence too often buries the voices of the marginalized. Her defiance calls us to listen, to look unflinchingly at cruelty, and to remember that beneath every empire, no matter how powerful, beats the restless heart of resistance. This is her legacy, a warning to the oppressor, a testament to the oppressed, and a story that refuses to be sweetened or silenced.